Auzubillahiminash-shaytanir-rajim. Bismillahir-rahmanir-rahim. As-salatu was-salamu ala Muhammadin wa alihi at-tayyibin at-tahirin. Rabbi shrah li sadri wa yassir li amri wa hlul uqdatam min lisani yafqahu qawli. Rabbi zidni ilman. So, assalamu alaikum everyone. The topic of our reflection today comes from Surah Al-Anfal, which is chapter 8 of the Quran, and it is verse 46 that we are reflecting on. And it continues the theme of our relationships with our community. So, verse 46 of Surah Al-Anfal comes with a warning. It says, "And do not quarrel, for then you will lose heart and your power will depart." So, as we have been saying, conflict with between a homogeneous or a diverse group, whether it's a marriage, a family, a workplace team, or a community, is inevitable. Differences in thought, personality, and approach are natural when people interact in personal relationships or even work together. But the strength of a team is not lost in conflict. We do not need to be afraid of differences or seek to avoid them, because differences can actually result in growth and in synergy. We do need to be careful in how we manage them, though. So, what this verse does in the Quran is it reminds us that it is division that weakens us. The word used in this verse, is wind, right, is particularly striking. So, just as a ship loses its momentum when it loses the wind in its sail, like a sailing ship, families, groups, and teams and communities, they lose their power, their energy, and the effectiveness when they allow petty quarrels to divert their focus and to overtake their mission. So, whether it is a family, a marriage relationship, or a working group, we can think of all of these groups of people as a team, which is defined as a group of people coming together to achieve a common goal. And what psychology tells us is that unresolved internal conflict within teams drains energy, lowers morale, and reduces effectiveness. Studies on workplace and relationship dynamics reveals the following effects of division. For example, there's a loss of collective focus. When people in a group are arguing over minor issues, they are shifting their attention away from shared goals and instead focusing on personal grievances. This, of course, weakens motivation and commitment. There is emotional exhaustion. Like, we've all experienced this, right? When you are constantly arguing with someone, or there's tension within a group or a team, it leads to stress and burnout. And when that happens, people disengage, they become cynical, or they simply stop contributing. There's, of course, a breakdown of trust, because when disagreements turn into personal attacks or rivalries, trust deteriorates. And without trust, we know collaboration is kind of impossible. There's also a reduced problem-solving ability. So conflict activates the brain's fight or flight response. We've talked about this before, making people defensive rather than creative. So instead of working towards solutions, teams get stuck in cycles of blame and resistance. So how can we overcome these differences? How can strong teams overcome these differences? And we keep saying team, but a family is a team, a marriage is a team, right? Ideally. So rather than eliminating differences, we can find ways to channel our diversity, our differences into strength. It turns out that high-functioning teams share certain characteristics. First of all, they stay focused on a shared goal, right? They don't get distracted by ego-driven disputes. They keep their eyes on the bigger picture. So whether it is a family, you have a shared goal of harmony, you have a shared goal of living a faith-driven life, for example, and they encourage open and respectful dialogue, right? Which can happen even with different perspectives, as long as we don't allow those differences to turn into personal battles. It's also a good idea to address conflicts early and constructively. So instead of letting resentment build by ignoring conflicts, it turns out that groups and teams that are successful, they find ways to discuss and resolve tensions before they escalate. and they actually appreciate different strengths. So effective teams understand that different styles and perspective complement each other. If one person is outgoing and the other person works really hard at home and is not interested in going out, if they can understand each other, that can be a great partnership. So instead of seeing differences as a threat, we can recognize them as an asset with potential for complementing existing strengths, right? So, once we recognize that differences are inevitable and we shift from a me versus you to a us versus the problem, this is very important. When we become fixated on winning arguments rather than solving problems, that becomes a problem, right? But if we shift our mindset to it is not you against me, but it's both of us. So let me give you an example. In marriage relationships, all couples do conflict in a certain way, right? It has a very predictable beginning, unpredictable issues, and it also has a predictable end, right? Now, once we begin to recognize that the problem is not that you do this and you start this and this is what I do, how about we actually recognize what happens, like the process of how we fight, right? If we begin to recognize the way we do conflict, right, our pattern of conflict, then we can learn to do something different. We can make different choices. But as long as we remain fixated on the fact that you are wrong and I am right, we can't make that progress, right? So, conflicts also, escalate because of defensiveness and this desire to be right. But if, we can step back again, the power of the pause, right? If we can step back and ask ourselves, what do we need to do to strengthen this relationship? What does this relationship need right now? Okay, it can really help shift this pattern that we get into. We can use a conflict resolution system. The simplest one of that is just simply start by acknowledging the issue, right? And it's also a good idea to actually bring up concerns earlier rather than later, rather than letting them fester. By ignoring something and sweeping it under the rug, so to speak, it doesn't solve anything. We can begin to listen with curiosity. So often we spend all our time trying to convince the other person. So when there's a disagreement, if you just step back and look, there are two people trying to convince the other person of their view, right? Each is doing the same thing and no one's listening, right? In order to shift this, we need to start listening with curiosity, listening with the goal to understand the other person's perspective. We don't have to agree with it. We don't have to have the same perspective. We don't have to change our perspective, but we do need to understand where the other person is coming from. Only then can we go to step 3, which is finding common ground, right? Looking for solutions that benefit both of us, right? That is a win-win that benefits the entire team rather than just one side. And here's the thing, when we are stuck, we can get help. If our internal efforts fail, we can involve a neutral third party, a mentor, a leader, a coach, a wise friend, a counselor, a mediator, to help understand each other and to find a balanced solution. So, if we reflect, are we allowing minor differences to escalate into division and conflict? When tensions arise, do we seek unity by eliciting and nurturing common ground, or do we get stuck in personal battles and petty differences? Are we creating an environment where people feel valued and heard, or are we contributing to unnecessary discord? So the Quran has warned us that disunity weakens us and unity propels us forward. Just as a ship cannot move without the force of the wind, we cannot succeed as families, as communities, organizations, or the Ummah unless we actively focus on what brings us together rather than what sets it apart. In today's world, my friends, this is much more than an idealistic vision. It is a matter of our survival. It's a matter of our survival. Divided, we will fall, and united, we can and we will thrive, inshallah.